Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're breaking down a fiery Senate speech that exposes deep partisan divides over the confirmation of presidential nominees. What once was a routine, bipartisan process has now turned into a political battlefield, with real consequences for the way our government functions. Let's walk through the 10 key takeaways you need to know. The speaker begins by recalling a 2022 statement from a Democratic leader. That statement highlighted a long tradition in the Senate presidents, regardless of party, could expect their nominees to be confirmed swiftly, often by unanimous consent or simple voice votes. Historically, this was the standard. George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton saw 98% of their nominees confirmed quickly. George W. Bush and Barack Obama both achieved about 90%. This ensured that presidents could form their teams and govern effectively.
Mr. President, for decades, Democrats and Republicans have regularly cooperated to swiftly confirm the many individuals selected by each president to serve in their administration. Regardless of the party in the White House, both sides have long agreed that a president deserves to have his or her administration in place quickly. That doesn't mean we don't disagree, but it does mean when nominees are held up, opposed, or blocked, it's for a legitimate purpose, not for leverage and partisan games to score political points at the expense of public safety, end quote. Let me just repeat that, Mr. President. That doesn't mean we don't disagree, but it does mean when nominees are held up, opposed, or blocked, it's for a legitimate purpose, not for leverage and partisan games to score political points at the expense of public safety, again, end quote. Now, Mr. President, none of those words are original to me. So far, I have simply been quoting the Democrat leader from back in 2022. But his words perfectly summarize the longstanding tradition of the Senate, a tradition that Democrats have destroyed this year. Mr. President, the Democrat leader correctly stated, and again I quote, "For decades, Democrats and Republicans have regularly cooperated to swiftly confirm the many individuals selected by each president to serve in their administration," end quote. Now, on a practical level, that's looked like expediting individual nominees and blocks of nominees by using unanimous consent or voice vote, which a way, as you know here in the Senate, Mr. President, of moving things along more quickly. During President George H.W. Bush's 4 years in office and President Clinton's first 4 years, both presidents had 98% of their civilian nominees, get this, 98% confirmed through unanimous consent or voice vote. George W. Bush, President Bush, and President Obama both had 90% of their civilian nominees confirmed by unanimous consent or voice vote in their first terms. And then we get to President Trump's first administration. Democrats, upset at the president's election, introduced an unprecedented new level of partisanship into the historically bipartisan confirmation process, forcing time-consuming votes on civilian nominees who would once have gone by unanimous consent or by voice vote. But even so, Mr. President, despite this new level of partisanship introduced by Democrats, both President Trump in his first term and President Biden had more than half of their nominees confirmed by unanimous consent or voice vote. Well, fast forward to today. President Trump has been in office for 8 months, and he has not had one single civilian nominee confirmed by unanimous consent or voice vote. Not one. Democrats have dragged out the process of every single nominee, even on nominees they ended up voting for by large margins. It's Trump derangement syndrome on steroids, Mr. President. That's right, Trump derangement syndrome on steroids. If this were a matter of historically bad nominees, as the Democrat leader tried to claim, then Democrats wouldn't be voting for a number of these nominees in committee or supporting them on final passage. No, Mr. President, this isn't about the quality of the candidates or any other substantive issue. This is simply the world's longest, most drawn out, temper tantrum over losing an election. Democrats can't stand the fact that President Trump was elected. And so they've destroyed decades upon decades of Senate precedent and turned a historically bipartisan process into an exercise in petty partisanship. An exercise in petty partisanship that is doing a profound disservice to the American people. Because, of course, Democrats' actions have consequences. First and foremost, those consequences are delays in filling essential positions throughout the administration, in our government, the people's government. Empty desks do not help the government function, and unnecessary delays rob a duly elected president of the team he needs to carry out his responsibilities. Dragging out confirmations also ties up the Senate floor. As the senior senator from Minnesota said last year, in what I would say were much less dire confirmation circumstances, and I quote, "As the Senate spends more of its time working on nominations, this leaves less time for legislating on issues that are important to the American people," end quote. Well, thanks to Democrats' historic obstruction, that is even more true today. We are, in fact, as the senior Democrat from Minnesota said, at risk of becoming, and I quote again, "a full-time employment agency," end quote. Mr. President, this situation has become unsustainable. To clear the current backlog of nominees on the calendar and in committee, we would need to take another 600 votes before the end of the year. Now, let me just repeat that to put it into context. To clear the current backlog of nominees on the calendar and in committee, we would need to take another 600 votes. Now, to put that number in perspective, that's more votes than this record-breaking Senate has taken all year up until now. And again, that's just for nominations that have already been sent to Congress, not those that are going to be forwarded and that we're going to have to process here additionally on top of the 600 votes between now and the end of the year. There literally are hundreds more nominations to come from the administration. So if Democrat obstruction continues, as Democrats have made abundantly clear that it will, there is no practical way that we could come close to filling all the vacancies in the 4 years of this administration, no matter how many hours the Senate works. And so, Mr. President, we've got a crisis. And it's time to take steps to restore Senate precedent and codify in Senate rules what once was understood to be standard practice. And that is the Senate acting expeditiously on presidential nominations to allow a president to get his team into place. And so this afternoon I'll be taking the necessary procedural steps to amend the rules. It is an idea, as I said earlier, with a Democrat pedigree. The senior Democrat, senator from Minnesota, along with her colleague in the Democrat caucus, the junior senator from Maine, made a similar proposal in 2023, which would have codified in Senate rules the longtime Senate precedent of en bloc nominations, of moving nominations in groups. Our measure is not as extensive, I should say, as that of my Democrat colleagues. It only applies to nominees at the sub-cabinet level and not to Article III judicial nominees as theirs did. But the proposals share the same objective, and that is providing for confirming groups of nominees all together so the President can have his team in place and so the Senate can focus on the important legislative work in its charge. Or to quote the senior Democrat from Minnesota on her very similar proposal, and I quote again, "This common sense reform will help improve efficiency and make sure we're able to fill positions that are vital to our national security, economic success, and more," end quote. Mr. President, 8 months of petty partisanship is long enough. This Senate has cast more votes up to this point than any Senate going back to the 1980s. We have been in more hours than any Senate going back a couple of decades. This historic obstruction ends now. Democrats have destroyed Senate precedent, and we're going to fix it. Fix it and ensure that in the future, duly elected presidents of both parties are able to get their teams in place without unnecessary delay so that they can fulfill their responsibilities to the American people. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Things began to change during Trump's first term. Democrats, upset over his election, slowed down confirmations. Still, over half of his nominees were eventually approved by expedited means. But now, in Trump's current term, not one single civilian nominee has been confirmed through unanimous consent or voice vote in the past 8 months. This marks a sharp break from decades of precedent. The Speaker argues this obstruction is not about the quality of nominees many are later confirmed with broad support, but rather about partisan resentment. The impact is significant. Vital government roles remain empty, administrative effectiveness suffers, and Senate floor time is consumed. Clearing the current backlog would require 600 additional votes this year, more than the Senate has taken in total so far. Even with longer hours, it would be nearly impossible to fill all vacancies within this presidential term. To resolve this gridlock, the Speaker calls for a rules change. The proposal would allow group confirmations for sub-cabinet nominees, restoring efficiency to the process. Interestingly, this idea mirrors reforms previously suggested by Democrats in 2023, showing that the concept has bipartisan roots. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Stay updated as we break down the stories shaping Washington and beyond. The speech ends with a firm message. 8 months of partisan obstruction is long enough. The Senate must fix this process, not just for the current administration, but for future presidents of both parties. Restoring efficiency would ensure that elections have consequences and that presidents can put their teams in place to serve the American people. The debate over nominations isn't just a fight between parties. It's a test of whether the Senate can still function as an institution. Will rules be reformed to restore tradition, or will partisan gridlock define the future? The answer will shape how every administration governs moving forward. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.